Chad Stebbins from the Institute of International Studies, and thank you for coming this morning. We have a terrific audience in the crowd. I see our president, our provost, a member of the Board of Governors, several faculty, retired faculty, people from the community, just a fantastic turnout. And this is the first lecture presentation of the Korea semester. There is an art exhibit put on by our students who went to Korea this past summer that ends tomorrow afternoon. So if you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to go over to the Spiva Art Gallery and check out the Reflections of Korea exhibit before it closes. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Gary Wintz from California. This is the third time Gary has spoken at Missouri Southern. He has kicked off the Thailand semester in 2012 and the Turkey semester in 2014. And he is probably the greatest worldwide expert on any country who I've ever met. If you read his biography in the program, you will see that he has been to over 220 countries, colonies, and territories. By comparison, I've only been to 25. Dr. Guevara, who just came in, he's only been to 35. So Gary Wintz, over 220, puts Dr. Guevara and me to shame, actually. He leads tours. He's a professional tour leader. And a week from now, he's going to be on his way to Burma to lead a group there. He is making 3 presentations here today, and then 2 of them tomorrow morning. Today is the top 10 things you should know about Korea. One little anecdote that's not in your program that I learned last night. He grew up in Indiana in a small town of about 3,000 and grew up during the start of the Cold War era and became very interested in international events. And when he was 12, he started working for his uncle who managed a golf course in this small town, and Gary worked full-time during the summers and was able to save up quite a bit of money. And when he was 13, he commented to his mother that when he was 17, when he graduated from high school, he would have saved up enough money to take his own trip to Europe. And she smiled and said, "Yes, Gary, that'll be fine," thinking he would forget about it. Well, as soon as he graduated from high school, he reminded his mother that he would be leaving for a 2-month trip around Europe, backpacking through Europe. And she almost had a heart attack. And Gary reminded her of this promise she had made 4 years earlier. And so he did spend 2 months going around Europe. He was arrested in Paris for sleeping under a bridge, charge of vagrancy. He went over to East Germany, East Berlin, had some marvelous experiences. So just a wealth of information that he has to share with us. So please join me in welcoming Gary Wintz to the stage.
I think that's the most heartwarming introduction I've ever felt, and it's because it's so close to my love of travel. It rekindles in me my love for the world and gratitude that I got to do that as a young person. When I came back to my small hometown of Batesville, Indiana, which, by the way, owns an enterprise here called Able Body. Anybody know that company? Owned by John Homebrand. We used to caddy for my father on the golf course. So it's a small town, but also a small world. So who would ever think I'd be in Joplin and somebody that used to caddy for my dad owning a company here. So that's how the world turns, and it's a marvelous planet, and we get to learn some more about this marvelous planet this morning, and I look forward to my talks on religion. I wish I could share all the things I'm going to talk about today. The other talk is a travel log through North Korea. So as a tour leader, actually I've been to North Korea a number of times, including recently, and my first time was 1975. So I've watched it change, and there's a lot going on in Korea today, and we have to hand it to Dean Stebbins, who has had the foresight to somehow know that this year, this Korea semester would be so timely. I don't know how he does it, but he seems to do this every time. He did this with Turkey, too. Has that been in the news lately? So those of you, I guess none of you, hopefully none of you were here at my Thailand talk in 2012, or it would show that you haven't done very well in school if you're still here. Maybe some faculty have been here. But I like to involve the audience because I find that the collection of us, all our brains together, is much better than the speakers. So I thought before I really got started to share with you what my top 10 are, and after all, anybody's top 10 is arbitrary. I mean, there's no one designated on the planet that gets to decide whether the 10 top things to know about Korea. So I'm wondering, out of you all here, how many of you here don't know anything about Korea? Well, that's pretty good. Now, I would like to ask some of you, what if you were up here trying to share what are the 10 top things everybody should know about Korea? What would some of them be? Anybody want to throw something out? Yes?
Well, the DMZ and that area.
About the DMZ. That is a very important thing to know about, and I was only going to refer to that in passing. But the DMZ, of course, is the area along the 38th parallel that divides North and South Korea. That division has been there since basically 1945, when Russians and Americans met at that border the same way Russians and Americans met in Berlin. So after the fall of the Axis powers of Germany and Italy and Japan, the Russians raced to get as much territory as they could, and the Americans raced to get as much territory as they could, because everyone could foresee there was going to be this gigantic battle between capitalism and democracy and freedom and totalitarianism and Marxism. And so the 38th parallel is where the Russians and Americans met, and for 5 years there was basically a tense standoff there. And finally, in 1950, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the communists of North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and well armed by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise attack in June of 1950. So after 45 for 5 years, it just sat stalemated at the border. In 1950, a surprise attack was launched at that 38th parallel, and later, in 1953, there was a truce. There has never been a peace treaty signed. We are still at war, legally, officially, on paper. North and South Korea and Russia and the U.S. are kind of still at war. Now, of course, Russia, the Soviet Union has fallen. The support for North Korea, although Russia still gives some support to North Korea, it's not very much. It's mostly in the form of criticism of U.S. policy against North Korea. But between 1950 and 1953, there was this horrible war that went back and forth. There was a time when, at the beginning of that surprise beginning war in June of 1950, that the troops of Kim Il-sung rushed down the Korean peninsula and basically chased the Americans practically to the sea. And then they called on General Douglas MacArthur from Japan, who was running Japan like an emperor himself, saying, "I'm running Japan better than the United States is being run by our current president." I'm talking about the current president back there. So General MacArthur comes up with a great plan to fool the communist Koreans and the Russians by coming around and landing halfway up the peninsula. So thereby cutting them in half, cutting the communist forces in half. And it was so successful, along with a good General Mike who came up from the south, that they pushed all the communist forces right up to the Chinese border. I mean, within miles of the Chinese border. And that was a silly thing to do. And Harry Truman said, "Don't do that." And MacArthur said, "Why not? I'm going to do it." And he went and did it, and waiting on the other side for the go-ahead was Chairman Mao, who launched hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops. And the Americans were totally ill-prepared for the cold winter, as all winters are in Korea. And they were pushed back again, pushed back way to the south again. And then finally, of course, we know they both ended up at the same place where they started in 1950, at the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, the 38th parallel. Now, this is not a straight line. The border follows contours of topography, but still today, that remains the meeting point. And I've been going to this place since 1975. I hope to tell a little story about that. But thanks for bringing that up. You enabled me to get done with some of the history quickly. So who else has one that should be in the top 10? Yes?
How do you put the Korean dictator back on the box?
That's one of the top 10 things you should know about Korea?
Yes, sir.
Nobody knows how to do that.
No, I'm sorry, I'm here.
It's not in my top 10. Okay. We might be consulting with you before the end. Now we have the president of the university, President Marvel. What an honor that you should be attending my talk. What might you put in your top 10? You're president, you must know something about Korea.
Be very similar. I'd like to know your assessment of the leadership of North Korea and the military threat with the missile testing.
So you would want people to know it's a pretty dangerous situation in Korea today.
Sure appears to be.
I concur. I think the whole world agrees. I think every country, including both North and South Korea. So we'll be talking, hopefully we'll get into that some more. I'm going to talk, part of my top 10 includes a few items about North Korea, and we'll get into this a little bit, obviously in the little amount of time that we have. We can't get into it very deeply, but this is the pressing issue today, right now. I turned on the news today, and there's a byline that the United States today in Korea, by the way, today in Korea is now tomorrow. They're more than about 12 hours ahead, so it's like tomorrow morning, early morning right now in Korea. But today, which was yesterday, the U.S. flew 2 bombers and also joined fighter jets together between the U.S. and South Korea and flew them over the peninsula in sort of a bombing test run, just to make sure that North Korea knows we have such items in our armaments. But this is going, so next we'll probably have another ballistic missile test from North Korea, and so it goes on, bullying and threats between both sides. So what is the way out? No one seems to have an answer. So it's fitting we should be talking about Korea. Who else? Who else has a topic that should be in my top 10? Yes?
So Gary, how did the South Koreans live under this daily terror?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and I'm not sure I would have talked about that because that wouldn't be in my top 10 so much, but this is interesting. The South Koreans are not talking about it like we are. Here we are in Joplin, Missouri, and we're talking about the horrible thing that on the Korean Peninsula. And the Koreans are going about, going to K-pop music concerts and writing new TV dramas that sell big in Japan and China, and they are so used to this. They're so used to hearing this go back and forth, all these threats going back and forth, that they've learned, like, let's just keep going. And guess what? They're now the 12th largest economy in the world. Little old South Korea is now the 12th largest economic power in the world. So they're just keeping their nose to the grindstone, like making money and creating rock and roll bands and digitizing. So they also are one of the leading innovators of digital technology in the world. When I was on a flight coming here, I was on a flight from LA to Denver, and then I changed planes to Tulsa. On the flight to Denver, guess who I got to? First of all, I got upgraded into first class, which is nice. I didn't deserve it, except I'm a 3 million mile flyer on United Airlines, and when you fly that many miles, sometimes they just give you a free upgrade. So they did that to me. And sitting next to me in first class on my flight to Denver was a Korean young man. What are the odds? Born in Korea. And here I am on my way to talk about Korea. So I thought, I wonder what his top 10 is. So actually the past few months, ever since I was invited by Dean Stebbins to come here, I've been interviewing people. So interviewing old friends of mine, old Korean friends, interviewing Robert Buswell, one of the leading Korean specialists in the world, who happens to be an old friend of mine that I met at a Buddhist temple in Korea in 1975. He was a young American man studying Buddhism, and he was a monk there. That's where I first met him, and now he's on the boards of chaebols. Who knows what a chaebol is? Well, it's going to be in the top 10 you're going to hear today. What do you get that for? I better keep moving here. So, however, I did ask this guy that's sitting next to me on the plane, this young man who was born in Korea, now lives in America. He said, must be some bigwig because he was in first class. He said he works in pharmaceuticals. I said, okay, do you go back to Korea? He says, oh, yeah. I says, okay, I got this lecture. I'm going to Joplin, Missouri. And I said, I'm giving this lecture on the 10 top things to know about Korea. What would you put in there? He didn't even stop to think about it. And I wrote it down here. His first thing was, what was his first thing? Oh, I got it. His first thing was wired. I said, what do you mean? He said, Korea is wired. He said the amount of digital innovation in Korea, led by the city of Seoul, which has a massive metropolitan population, of about half the country is in Seoul and the surrounding areas of Incheon and so forth. 25 million people live in this area, and they are all wired. The whole city is accessed. You can access internet anywhere, more than any other city in the world. He said that Koreans are the most wired people on earth. And he said Seoul is a hub for digital information and for the sharing economy. And it's a leader in digital public access. And the second thing he said that you should know about the Korean people is that they are active. I said, what do you mean by that? He says, I mean like they're energetic. I mean, he says, like you walk down the streets of Seoul at 1 in the morning, and there's people going to nightclubs, and it is active every night. These people are living life to the fullest, perhaps because of that underlying fear that they could be demolished within an hour at any time. They're living life to the fullest. And actually, one of my top 10 is, well, I'm not going to tell you. I'll get there. But it actually, well, okay. Instead of saying Koreans are active, I say Koreans are high energy. But we'll get to that in a minute. And finally, the third thing he said, the American people should know something about Korea that they probably don't know, and that is about the chaebols. There's that word again, chaebols. How many people in here know what a chaebol is? Wow. And nobody has raised, somebody knows, they're just not raising their hand. Somebody has to know. I bet the president knows. Oh, we have one person here. What's a chaebol?
Big, rich man.
A big what?
Rich people.
Rich people?
They didn't give money to others because their family wanted to their family.
Families of rich people. Where are you from?
Korea.
That's why she knows what a chaebol is. She's the only one here in the whole room who knows what a chaebol is. And she's from Korea. So that's in my top 10 too. So we'll be talking a little bit more about what they are down the road. Okay. Anybody else got anything in the top 10 you think should be in my top 10 today?
How did South Korea become an economic power?
How did it become an economic power? That should be in my top 10, is how South Korea became an economic power. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that, but I'll talk about it right here, because it's the story of Western Europe after World War II. So remember the Marshall Plan? So Europe was devastated by World War II. And how did it become one of the great regions of the world today economically? Through the Marshall Plan, through USA, through interconnectedness and trade with the United States, U.S. becoming a military umbrella for them, allowing them to develop. So the same thing in South Korea. So after the Korean War was over, the U.S. poured lots of money into South Korea, investment money, protection money, and a lot of trade went on. Koreans came to America. Do you know that the second largest city in the world is Los Angeles, is Koreans? There's there's like 400,000 Koreans. 400,000 Koreans in Los Angeles. So there's been a lot of interconnectedness. And so a lot of why Korea is now the 12th most powerful economic force in the world is the same reason Western Europe is. Same kind of development. Now they had dictators in their early years. I'll talk a little bit about that. So it wasn't all smooth with as it was with the democratic powers of Europe. But they now have reached democracy. They have reached such full democracy that they just threw out their last president for corruption charges. That's pretty good, thinking that they used to kill protesters and dissidents in the streets, thousands of them at a time, some of the past dictators of, quotes, free and democratic South Korea. Okay, anybody else? Number one. The Korean people are all one people. Whether you're from North Korea or South Korea, you ask them, is Korea two peoples? They say, no, we're all one people. They all agree they're all one people. They've always been all one people. Even under the Japanese imperialist, colonialist power, they were one people. They were under the Japanese, but they were one people. It was only in 1945, when the Russians came down from the north, Americans came from the south, and the country was divided. It's the only time in their history they've really been divided in this kind of dramatic way. So all these years, none of the people, even the northerners, even the southern, none of them say we should be separate, we should be together. They just can't figure out how to do it. So they're a common history. For example, they've always been shadowed by whom? Who has Korea always been shadowed by in their history in terms of another power? China. China's on their northern border big time. There's 1.3 billion Chinese today, and there's these two nations of North and South Korea that are less than 100 million, there's 24 million in North Korea and 51 million in South Korea. And there's 1.3 billion Chinese. So still today, China overshadows them. So they're always fighting off the Chinese, whether it's the Han Dynasty, Chinese thousands of years ago, whether it's the Tang Dynasty making encroachments, whether it's the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty. They're always fighting off China, and still today they're fighting off China. So when MacArthur raced up to the border to China and scared them, and Mao Zedong launched his troops down, here we are, China's back on our land again. Of course, the northerners were happy for a while that China was there. But now China's trying to tell North Korea what to do, because we're pressuring China to help us, so China's overshadowing them again. So they've always had this history, but they've always been one people. There were times in Korean history where they were ruling their own roost. It's not to say that China always dominated them, it's just that they were just fighting them. So sometimes they had long periods of peace where they had a strong government and they were able to hold the Chinese off at bay. There's some interesting things in their history. For example, in 1234, Korea was the first country to develop movable type. Now, we heard that was Gutenberg. Well, that's the Western alphabet. But the Koreans at the time were using Chinese characters, and they actually invented a type of movable type, not made out of cardwood, but even made out of metal. 1234. It shows the great cultural advancements that Korea has made on its own, in its own time, within its own history. That's just one example. A couple hundred years later, they developed their own written language. So instead of having borrowed their written ideograms from China, they developed their own script in a couple hundred years after that. And that's the script that the Koreans now use. So this is common to both North and South. That same script, the same language, the same history, the same culture, and even the love of the same song. Now I know there's one person in here that's going to know this answer. What is the most popular song in all of Korean history amongst North and South? Yes, of course, she got the answer. Auditorium. This is a. Can you sing that for us? just you know. Come on, can you come up? It's such a beautiful melody. You could say me all these. You could say me all these words about why these two, North and South, love the same song. If you sang it, everybody would understand why. So both countries have that in common. Thank you. What a gift. Thank you. You can sing well. Did you do that again? Maybe later if we got time. Actually, tomorrow, I'm going to play some of this melody when we talk about my travels in North Korea. So, that was number one. What was number one? Who can tell me what number one was that I think everybody should know? Korean people are one people. Thank you. Guess what number two is? I already gave you a hint about my conversation with that guy on the airplane in first class. He said they are really active people. So what my notes say, Koreans are a high energy people. That's how I would have said it. These are my notes from before I was sitting next to him. So he was just affirming my own conclusions. Both North and South are high energy. Now we've already said South Korea actually has the 12th largest economy in the world. And for such a small country, they got the 12th largest economy. They must be high energy people. But look at North Korea. 24 million people, one of the few countries in the world that has nuclear weapons, that has intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, I'm not saying that's a great thing to be proud of. I'm not happy that they got it, but it tells you something about these people. They're hardworking, they're smart, they're industrious, they're studious. I mean, if they could do that, they must have something going for them in their national character. It may be twisted. It may not be what we would want to elevate as a good quality to have, but they've got something going for them. They are a hearty people. They're a hearty people. One of the things I remember about in Korea, when they would go out of their way to help you. Anytime you would ask, where is such and such? They would take you. They wouldn't just say, well, you turn left here and then you go right there. They said, I'll take you. That's that high energy of Korean people. They're a very hospitable, they're a strong people. They're a hearty people. Now, high energy doesn't always mean good, as we talked about North Korea. So I want to tell you, Korean people can be also very zealous. And religion is a good example of that. I have a whole talk about religion tomorrow, and I'll be talking more about all the religions in Korea. But I want to tell you, the Koreans are just as high energy about their religion as anything else. Do you remember Sun Moon? Remember who he was? The founder of the Unification Church, a Protestant sect that went off on its own. And remember, he used to have weddings. Do you remember the weddings he would have? Some of them in this great Protestant Minister Unification Church. He would have weddings of like 5,000 couples at a time. That means 10,000 people getting married like in a huge arena. I mean, talk about zealous. Talk about high energy. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like to have 5,000 weddings going on at the same time, married by the same guy? South Korea, now we're talking about South Korea because North Korea has no religion anymore, at least that anybody can talk about. Of course there are Christians there, but they have to keep it hidden. Of course there are Buddhists there, but they don't talk about it because they are in a godless totalitarian society that doesn't allow religion. But I can only talk about South Korea and their religion today. And that is the South Koreans have, out of the 10 mega churches in the world, you know what a mega church is? Mega church are these large, basically prosperity-oriented Protestant sects that create these huge churches of 25,000 people. They're usually TV evangelists. They're famous, very charismatic, and they've created these huge churches like 20, 15,000 people. These are mega churches. Out of the 10 mega churches in the world, the 10 Christian prosperity mega churches in the world, 6 of them are in Korea. The other 4, you know where the other 4 are?
Here.
United States.
Yeah,
Exactly. So, out of the 10 in the world, 4 in the U.S., 6 are in North Korea, and they're the top 6. They're the biggest 6. And I can tell you a personal story. Remember I said Professor Robert Buswell, who's head of Korean and Buddhist studies at UCLA, one of the leading, he's such a leading person of Korean knowledge and culture that he is board of directors in Chaebol. So anyway, he's a personal friend of mine. He's the guy who said that was a monk when I first went to this Buddhist monastery. I wanted to learn. When I travel around the world, I go to mosques, I go to Sikh temples, and I go and live with these people, and I study with them. So I went to a Buddhist monastery in the mountains out of Gwangju, Songkwangsal. Beautiful temple, remote. You can't get there by road. You have to hike in with your backpack. And when I was there, I thought, I was going to be the only American to ever visit the place. It's so remote. I thought they were going to be going crazy. Who is this guy? And here they had 5 monks from America studying. One of them was Robert Buswell. But later, the head monk from that temple was at their home temple in Seoul. And they invited my first partner, Molly, and I. We were traveling together at the time. We both were studying Buddhism at the time at this Korean temple. They invited us to come up to Seoul. They said, we're going to have a gathering up in Seoul. Please come and join us. And we said, wow, cool, okay. And so we get up there, and it's an outdoor arena, and they have a stage there, and there's 5,000 people there. And when we arrived, they said, oh, follow us. And they came and they brought us up on stage. And we're going what? And they said, here's your seat, sit down here. And we're in the first row on the front of the stage. We're going, what is going on? And we kept hearing them say in Korean, we didn't speak Korean, but we kept hearing our names being spoken. We're going, what's going on? And then finally they called us up. They said, Gary, Molly, please come up here. And then they said some Korean words to us, and then they said to say in Korean, whatever it was, I do or something. And it turns out they had just baptized us into the Buddhist faith without our permission, in public. So I'm talking about high energy people, passionate people, zealous people, Pretty exciting. So then the baseball, North Koreans are good in baseball. We actually have some we have some South Koreans that are on professional baseball teams in the U.S. now, and they're up and coming. There's a lot of them in minor leagues. We're going to be hearing more about them. These are high active people. Okay, what was our first point? Koreans are all one. Second one, they're high active people. Third one, and these next points are going to be about North Korea. So we've been talking largely about South Korea, though not completely. But now we're going to do a few points about North Korea. And one is that North Korea is the last of an ideological species left on Earth. And we're talking about Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist ideology. So we all know Karl Marx. You know, if Karl Marx saw what happened to his political philosophy, he'd be turning over in his grave. But we all know that history. I don't have to run through that. The Soviet Union, the Stalinist time, the purges, where millions of people, entire races of people were moved from here to there to Siberia. And do you know that Stalin killed more people than Hitler? Stalin's responsible for about 30 million deaths. This is what happens in a totalitarian society where the government has complete and total control and even tries to control your mind. So this is what we have in North Korea. North Korea has been communist since the 40s, since Kim Il-sung, and then in 1945 when Russia came in and supported them, Russia was still a Stalinist country. Stalin was still in power. So you can imagine the kind of indelible mark he left on North Korea, that same kind of mentality, like by the state, for the state, of the state, not by, for, of the people. And as we have seen, this guy today, the grandson of the founder, Kim Il-sung, the son of Kim Jong-il, so he's now third in a dynasty, and that's kind of what makes this ideological species a little different from the other ideological species that we've known as communists in the world. I'm talking about the old-style Stalinist type of communism, so the communism of the Soviet Union, of Vietnam, of Cambodia, of Laos, of Cuba, on and on. We all know who those communist countries used to be. Some of them remain communist. Cuba is still kind of a communist country. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, they all still have a lot of communist influences to them, and except for Cambodia, they all claim to still be communist. But they've eased off a little bit. Now, they haven't eased off in freedom or democracy for their people. They're still ruling the way they do and don't really pay attention to the votes of the people, except when the vote is 1,000 to 0 in the parliament, that kind of voting. So there still is a lot of communism running around the world, but it's much more watered down, especially in terms of economics. I mean, look at China. Believe me, China is still a communist country when it comes to treating its people without the gifts of freedom and democracy. But they get to have money anyway. So they get to make money, they get to work, they get to do their own thing now. But not North Korea. North Korea is the last of an ideological species. It's the last of the hardcore. And that comes with all the trappings, like mind control, like propaganda, you know, like repetition of truth. So they say, you live in the workers' paradise. All the other countries of the world are poor. They're starving. Their governments don't take care of them. They have hurricanes and the government just sits there and does nothing. Look at these pictures from the United States. But we live in the workers' paradise. And they wake up to that. They wake up, the whole country wakes up to an anthem in the morning that goes, we are the happy people. So everybody thinks they're happy people. Because they've been told, you are a happy people, 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 you're always a happy people, and everybody else is not happy. So this is this is what makes North Korea such a hard pickle to deal with, to handle. Because a lot of the people are brainwashed. Now, not all of them. There are scholars, Bruce Bennett of the RAND Corporation, who has done studies and research on interviews made with Korean refugees, North Korean refugees, who escape out of North Korea. These people end up in South Korea because South Korea welcomes any North Koreans who can escape. Now, they can't escape across the DMZ. That's just plain impossible. They just can't do it there. But they escape through China, or they escape by a little dinghy boat or a rowboat or something, go to Japan. But those who escape, they can all end up in North Korea and South Korea. Most of them do end up in South Korea. And they get interviewed by sociologists because they were trying to learn what's it like there. And they have concluded from interviewing all these North Koreans, obviously they didn't believe they were in a happy paradise because they escaped. You know, why do you need to escape if you're in the #1 happy country in the world? They knew they were not in the number. Somehow, despite all that mind control, despite all that propaganda, people learn about the outside world and they go, I want some of that, and I'm willing to chance my life rather than continue to live in this country. So by interviewing these now there's 29,000 refugees of North Korean descent in South Korea. They interviewed all these people, and they've concluded that 40% of the population of North Korea is hostile in their minds to the government. They're not hostile in spoken language because you just dare utter one word against the government, and if you, a child of your parent, you hear your parents saying that, and when you're in school, they say, has your parents said anything bad about the country? You know, so you don't, as a parent, you don't say to your kid, hey kid, I want to tell you it's a different world out there and it's not good here, and you know, hang on, we're going to get freedom someday. No parent's going to dare to say that to their kid. And yet, 40% of the population is hostile in their minds to the government. So that's a pretty good statistic, and it's fairly reliable because it's done with interviewing lots of people. Now, admittedly, these are all refugees who, you know, are part of that 40%, but they must have friends and relatives who might feel the same way. They just couldn't tell it to them. So these are all parts of totalitarianism of that old ideological species, which is only left now in North Korea. But it's important for us to understand this, and it's why I believe it's good for us to go to North Korea as a tourist. I mean, the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations with North Korea. We're not talking to them face to face. All we're doing is threatening them and bullying them. Are we going to get anywhere doing that? So far we haven't. That hasn't seemed to work. Let's at least give people a chance. But I can tell you, even as a tour group, we don't really get a lot of freedom. And I'll be talking more about this tomorrow because I'm going to talk about being a tourist. But just a quick story. My guide asked me, he said, how many people in your travel company, how many tourists do you have in your travel company every year? And I said, well, I'm just a freelance tour leader. I said, I don't know any of the companies I work for. I don't really know what goes on in their business life or the office. They just hire me to do a job at a time. I said, I don't really know how many how many tourists they have a year. I said, you know, maybe, I don't know, I said maybe 5,000, you know, another company might have 20,000. I said, but you could find that out on the internet. I said, just go to the internet, and just internet that name of that company, and it will probably say how many. And they go, oh, we don't have internet here. I said, you don't have internet? He said, well, we have intranet. So we have, within the country of North Korea, we have intranet. So we all have cell phones, and we all access and can do searches in North Korea. But of course, it's all controlled by the government. And what does the first thing say when it pops up on your screen? It says, welcome to the happiest country in the world. The only country that has internet as good as us. We're #1. So I mean, this is their life. This is how it goes. So the next point. So first one, Korea's all one. Number 2, high energy people. Number 3, last of an ideological species. Number 4, North Korea is always on a war footing. Actually, so is South Korea. South Korea's got troops at the border. South Korea's training, like today, or as in yesterday, when they're flying with American jets and so forth. They're on war footing too, but we aren't told about the South on war footing. The North is told about the South always being on war footing. They're taught about the American nuclear weapons that are being stored on the island of Guam, just 2 hours flight away to bomb North Korea. They're told about that every day, just as we are told every day about the new nuclear weapons of the North and the ballistic missiles. But they are even on more war footing than we are. We don't hear that every day, although we've been hearing it every day for a while since we've been. But we have been, the North Koreans wake up to that every day. Don't forget, they could come across the border at any time. And they've been on this war footing since the Korean War. And just think about what happened in the Korean War. They really got bombed. They got bombed a lot by the U.S., and there's a tremendous amount of resentment, just like somebody who's from Hiroshima or Nagasaki or the fire bombings of Tokyo. Those people still don't have a lot of respect for the U.S. because of what happened to them. So remember, North Korea has suffered from the U.S. already, a terrible war. And, of course, the South did too. But North Korea has stayed on war footing. There's never been an armistice signed. There's only ever been a temporary truce. It's called a stalemate. There's still a stalemate, and they have one of the largest armies in the world, and they've got the modern technology, as we've seen. Their economy is a military economy, so all those 24 million people basically are working to stay on a war footing. But worst of all is their minds are on a war footing. That means they're ready to go to war. And they have a supreme leader who they don't doubt, who they treat as a god, who says, do this, and they go, yes, sir. Or no, they say, yes, Holy One. And they're treated like gods. They really are. I'll tell more about that on my stories tomorrow. Travel in North Korea. How we had to bow down to these gods of the dynasty. So anyway, North Korea, it cannot be overstated how they just have a mentality of war all the time. They're ready to go. They're ready to go right now. And they're ready to fight to the death because they're going to fight for their supreme leader. Because they've been told they got the #1 country in the world, they got the most powerful country in the world, they got the smartest country in the world, they're the happiest people in the world. Yes.
Sad but true. And finally, the last point I want to make that is specifically about North Korea is the Hermit Kingdom.
So the Hermit Kingdom actually goes back in history at times when after Korea succeeded yet again in pushing the Chinese back and so forth, they kind of went into an isolationist policy. And that's really where the first phrase came to be known at, like in the 1800s, as the Hermit Kingdom. But now it really is a Hermit Kingdom because, they don't have really any friends anymore. I mean, China has basically been trying to tell them what to do, and they're not listening to them, so what kind of friend is that? And Russia, holds them at arm's length, but only kind of defends them when they can embarrass the U.S., so they're not really good friends of them. So they are really isolated, and they're really doing things on their own. Now, what happens when you get that kind of a state where you don't have to be accountable to anybody? North Korea is not accountable to anybody. And first of all, they've hated the Chinese for overtaking them all these centuries. Can you imagine the centuries and centuries of bad racial feelings against Chinese in Korea? So even now, even though the Chinese communists came across the border and helped them push MacArthur back and so forth, and yes, for all these years they've been allies, but in recent years, China's gone its own way. It's no longer as communist as it used to be. It wants to be friendly with the rest of the world. It doesn't want to be allies of North Korea. But at the same time, they can't just cut loose of them and let go of them because that's their border. And the last thing they want is a South Korean, U.S.-supported democracy on their border of China. Maybe they'd rather have this little buffer zone called North Korea on their border instead of worrying about the American military being right up on their border again. So the point is, though, that North Korea is really a hermit kingdom. And when you're not accountable to anybody, you don't have to care what anybody thinks about you. Right? You can do whatever you want. And it seems like the North Koreans have no moral compass. They don't have the same moral system that the rest of the world has. They are guilty of doing lots of really weird, bad stuff. I mean, like really bad. And it seems like they get by with it. Did you hear about the stepson of Kim Jong-il? That would be the stepbrother of the current supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. Did you hear about him last February? He had said some bad thing. In other words, he could have been the leader of North Korea. He was not, Kim Jong-un, the current leader, was not the first one chosen to succeed Kim Il-sung. It was Kim Jong-nam. But he made a mistake. So back when he was a favored child and spoiled child, he got one of his friends in the Ministry of Passports to give him a passport, fake passport, because he wanted to go to Disneyland in Japan, in Tokyo. He heard about Disneyland. And for some reason, he didn't really believe that the North Koreans were the happiest people in the world, and he wanted to go see what their Disneyland was like. And he got busted by the Japanese at Disneyland, and they found that he had a fake passport. And it turns out he was the son. He was a stepson of Kim Jong-il, at that time the leader of the country. And so anyway, this guy though, he kind of escaped and never went back to Korea. And for a long time he remained silent about, he just was smart enough to stay silent. But in the past couple of years, he started saying like, wow, North Korea's really gone crazy. My stepbrother Kim Jong-un, that guy is nuts, And guess what happened? Last February, at an airport in Malaysia, two hired hands came up and had a rag of VX nerve agent and just rubbed it over his face. They were wearing gloves. They just rubbed it over his face. And within a couple hours, the guy was dead. I mean, that's the kind of stuff they do. That's what a rogue state does. That's what a renegade state does. That's what a state does that is not accountable to anybody else in the world. And they, of course, they were hoping they wouldn't be found out. But they figured out, hey, this was the guy that was going to be the leader of North Korea, and he said some bad things about Kim Jong-un, and now look what's happened to him. So we've got, there's all kinds of things that have happened over the years. You may not know about this. Like, this was in the 80s, but there was an airplane that they put bombs on an airplane. This was a commercial airliner flying from Delhi to Bangkok that blew up over Burma. And it was the North Koreans that were blowing up a filmmaker from North Korea who had defected. So they blew up the whole airplane as a way to get this guy. And then another time when Burma used to be a socialist country, and they used to be relations only with North Korea. But about 30 years ago, they developed relations with South Korea. And when they had, they brought when they were having a ceremony of establishing relations between South Korea and Burma in Rangoon, in the old capital of Burma at the time, there was a bomb that went off on the stage where they were celebrating the ceremony. 6 South Korean cabinet ministers were killed, and some high officials of the Burmese government were killed. Well, of course, everybody knew who did it. North Korea was peeved at Burma, their old socialist friend, for recognizing South Korea equally as another country. So I mean, they do stuff like that. But that's not all. Have you ever heard of the abductions they did from the Japanese? Like this actually happened. A school teacher, like a Japanese teacher of Japanese language at a school in a remote province, is walking along a beach that faces Korea, where the Koreans can come in, slipping in by small boats, and they kidnap her. And they bring her to Korea to teach them Japanese. And they've done this to quite a number of Japanese. Over the years, they've abducted people without their permission, quietly, without anybody knowing it. And the way we know that that's where, because these people just disappeared, they were just called disappeared. Nobody knew how come these people are disappearing off of beaches. And like about 20 years later, someone was walking through a park, a Japanese tourist was walking through a park in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and they saw a woman that it was their sister who was abducted. And they ran up to her and they said, "Sister." And she goes, "Oh my God, oh, I'm so happy." And she lost her composure and said, "Oh, I've been abducted." So then they realized all these other people were like that. And in fact, that teacher also, they found out later. So I mean, North Korea does stuff that's really not nice. And have you heard about their state executions? Like, when they execute somebody, like the uncle, his uncle, I think when he was executed, was it him or somebody else? They tied him up at a stake, and then they had an aircraft with artillery come down, mowing down by airplane. I mean, like, a little bit of overkill. But, like, What are they thinking? And of course, well, I could just go on and on. We're going to skip the rest of the stuff. It's too depressing. And after all, we're only on point 5. Dean Stebbins, how much time we have left?
Well, 15 minutes.
Oh dear. And that includes question time?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, it's been interesting, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Well, we can do this. We can do this, and we can still have questions. Just remember the big 5. Okay. Now, I've been saying a lot of positive things about South Korea, but you need to know there's also some, just like any country in the world has scandals, and they've had a few lately. So we should mention that because they've been in the news, and it's very much in the consciousness of South Koreans. So it's not a perfect, happy society all the time. I would say South Korea is much happier than the North. They're so happy they're not even worried about all this threats of war. They're just like having their K-pop. But they have had scandals, and so the recent president, who just got thrown out of office because she was involved in a corruption scandal, there's also been scandals with Samsung, one of the chaebols. It's almost time to get to the chaebols. But the head of Samsung is in jail right now. And that used to not happen. And there's been all kinds of things that are happening, like there was a ferry boat that turned over about more than 2 years ago now. And this was a horrible scandal because it shouldn't have happened. The boat was overloaded. They were going against the government regulations about how they loaded it. They weren't operating it correctly. They didn't have enough life vests. This was a horrible scandal because one of the things that's common in all of Asia is of saving face. And South Koreans are a proud people, like every nation is proud. So when something like that happens that makes it across the world news about this ferry boat tipping over, all the South Koreans feel shame. So these are some of the sad things that have been happening in South Korea, and it wouldn't be fair if we didn't cover that as some of the top things to know about all of Korea. Next is, now I asked Dean Chad Stebbins, who's been planning the Korea semester. I said, Dr. Stebbins, I said, if you were giving us talk today, what would you put in your top 10? And right away he said, food. So I said, oh, I know your priority. So in fact, this is true, and he was lamenting the fact that in Joplin there is not yet a Korean restaurant. And he says, and they got 5 in Springfield. Why should Springfield have 5 Korean restaurants and not one here? Ladies and gentlemen, we need to get a Korean restaurant. And it will be here soon enough because Korean restaurants are becoming like a fad and trend. Like in Los Angeles, of course, where we have 400,000 Koreans, there's lots of them. But all over the world, Korean cuisine has become in. And just as I told you that story about sitting next to that guy on the plane that was from Korea, a few months ago, shortly after I got this assignment from Dean Stebbins to give this talk, I was sitting next to a Korean on another plane on Asiana Airlines flying nonstop from Seoul to San Francisco. I'm sitting next to him. He was flying back to LA because he's Korean. He's a chef. And I said, I actually have plans to do in my top 10 about Korea, about food. And I said, I was going to say that the main thing to know, one of the top 10 things to know about Koreans is that they like garlic. And he said, no. He said, kimchi. He said, kimchi's #1. So kimchi is like a fermented cabbage. And he said, that's even more important than garlic. But the reason I thought of garlic is my first wife, Molly, used to be a flight attendant on Pan American Airlines. She used to fly to Korea all the time, and she'd always say, she always knew where the plane had just come from when she would get on a plane in LA. She would know that that plane must have just come from Korea because the whole plane smelled like garlic. Chaebols. We're finally there, ladies and gentlemen. Chaebols. Chaebols are family-owned conglomerates. They're sort of like the Rockefellers, except they got a bunch of them. There are like, how many? 7? Maybe 7 main chaebols that are like Samsung is one. So Samsung is owned by a big family, and they do lots of things. They just don't do the Samsung 7. By the way, do you know that their cell phones are selling even better now than ever before, even after their 7s caught on fire? Because they still got a really good product. They just had to change the battery. So Samsung does all kinds of things. I mean, they make bicycles, they make heavy equipment, they clothing. I mean, they're in everything. And so are all the other conglomerates. Chaebels, C-H-O-E-B-E-L-S. This must be important, or it wouldn't be in the top 10. Nor would it have been the third one that the guy sitting next to me on the plane said. You should tell them about how wired Korea is. You should tell them about how active the people are, and you should tell them about the Chaebels. They need to know this is different than in the U.S. That there are these huge family-owned conglomerates that basically run the country. But something's happened. I just told you that the head of Samsung's in jail right now for a scandal. So the Chaebels are being corralled a little bit. Democracy is taking over capitalism a little bit, putting it a little bit better in balance. And now my second last one, culture. Culture in general. But Chad Stevens said, you should also, say something about K-pop. Because he said, if you ask an American teenager, what do they know about Korea? They go, K-pop. And Gangnam Style. Yeah. I bet you can do that. Can you come up and do that better? Can you do that while at the same time as singing Auditorium? You wouldn't do that because Auditorium is too beautiful. That song is so lovely. Okay, so culture here. Korea is not just a cultural giant in Korea. They are a cultural giant in America, K-pop, as we mentioned, but also drama. They have these sitcoms and they have these soap operas. The #1 soap opera in China, guess where it's from? South Korea. The #1 soap opera, watched by hundreds of millions of people in China, is from South Korea. Japan, the #1 soap opera in Japan, the old arch enemy of Korea, Korean soap operas. These guys are good. They're good at movies, they're good at TV, and all these other trends, including Gangnam Style dancing and K-pop. Now, finally, I'm ending with, and it's good that we covered a lot of this already, but we should know one of the top 10 things to know about Korea is that they have some really important neighbors around them. It's important to know not just the country, but who's around you. Now, we've covered China and all those reasons. Move on to Japan. Japan took over Korea in 1910 as a colony, and they mistreated them badly, as Japan was famous for having done everywhere they took over, whether it was Indonesia, or Guam, or the Marianas, or Vietnam, or China. I mean, in the rape of Nanjing, 100,000 people killed by Japanese troops. Comfort women of Korea, that is where Korean women were forcibly put into brothels to serve the Japanese army. That is still an issue today. There's a lot of strong feeling about that. It's still a big issue today in relations. And the Japanese just don't get it. If they would just say, we're sorry, and keep saying. They said, well, we said we were sorry back in 1987. We said we were sorry. Why do we have to say it again? Say it as often as people are still alive and their grandchildren are still alive. We never should have done it. So they also have relations with Taiwan. Taiwan is really a close ally. Taiwan has suffered under the communist Chinese as South Korea did. So the neighbors of Korea are also important in that top 10. Okay, questions? We made it. We got through the 10. We don't have many minutes left. By the way, how many are in here from sociology of religion? You want to write down those names and make sure those are not here?
Thank you.
Okay.
That's why it's on campus.
Anybody have any questions? Excellent. What's your name? Thank you so much. That was a beautiful song. We'll hear more of that song tomorrow when I talk about my travels in North Korea.